flowers. And how much do I like flowers? So much. Flowers sparkle like buttercups.
An eternity in bloom, a flicker in flower, a flicker, an eternity in you.
Sweet are the dreams of yesteryear, of times you never saw. Sweet are the dreams of villainy, to suit your present trial. Sweet are the dreams that take you back, and bid you what if could have been, and if only it wasn't in the never was, that never comes. Bittersweet the bursting of the dream, to know those before did not do as you see with hindsight they should. Bittersweet to know that those hereafter will think the same when their dreams have soured. Bittersweet to think that those before thought the same of theirs, in the never was that never comes.
Evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome this evening to the first of what will become a bi-weekly show. Well, that we're going to be focusing mostly on the UK, as I'm going to be joined by two of my good friends and very knowledgeable friends, Steed and Aedric. All of us are from the UK, so it will be a more UK-based show, as I said, but it will be coming out bi-weekly, so every 2 weeks. We're put the show out there, and like I say, we're going to be covering the UK mostly. Anyway, there will be some crossover, obviously, as what we're facing as a people at the moment is a global situation. However we want to look at it, especially for the West, anyway, Europe and America and Australia. So tonight, one of the biggest stories coming out of the UK at the moment is that we are going to be forced to wear masks in shops. If we want to go to any shop on the 24th of this month, we will have to wear a mask. Now, people that are more familiar with Mimirs Council will know that some of our earlier work, we did some documentaries and we did some live discussions with the good folk here with me this evening about COVID-19. We've talked at length about what it means to us as nationalists, because I know that there are still some in our circles that are a bit confused as to why we may link these, and we'll be going through that a little bit tonight. We're also going to be going a little bit through some of the psychology of the people that are accepting the masks or accepting the lockdowns as it was before, because these are important points that we want to look at, because as I'm going to show later on, we've got a lot in the UK at least, and I believe this is true for America as well. We're getting people that are non-mask wearers. I don't know what the actual term is for that, but they're being linked in the UK to Brexiters, to climate change deniers. Essentially, we're these selfish individualists that don't care about anybody but ourselves. So that's why we voted Brexit, and that's why we're pro-white, and that's why we don't want to wear masks, right? There's this running theme that we're going to go over, and like I say, we're going to relook at the psychology of this a little bit tonight and see why the left, or why they are more susceptible to this than, say, people on our side of the fence. Although, like I say, there are some that are, and we're going to try and discuss that too. But it's going to be going on for about an hour-ish, the show. We're going to keep it to around there. So without further ado, I'll introduce the two guests this evening that will be constants in this bi-weekly show. So, hey, Steed there. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, good evening, Phil. Always good to speak to you. Yeah, I'm good tonight.
Yeah. And there you go, Edric. You doing okay?
Yeah, not too bad, mate. Good talking to you too.
Yeah, and if there's Edric might be having some internet problems, and we do apologise for that in advance if any of that occurs. It's something that now we are going to do it bi-weekly. He's going to sort out, so just wanted to put that out there in case he breaks up a little bit. It's something that we're going to sort out for the future. So, guys, does anybody want to start off with the new mask insanity over here in the UK?
I'll get things started with just a little thing to say before we open up to the sort of proper discussion surrounding these masks. It's almost comical in a way that they've started to present this mandated mask wearing in some media articles and things like that as being a means to protect to protect our shop workers. Now, it's kind of a strange way to put it when we're not being made, in terms of officially being made, to wear masks in public because you got to drink and whatever. But we need to look after our shopkeepers and because apparently they're getting the virus more than other people and things like that because constantly, interact. If that's the case, then why, is it okay to not wear them in pubs and restaurants? It's funny that it's got to become apparent as we look into it more and more that at every turn there's a contradiction. There's a sort of, it doesn't add up with itself. But yeah, I think it's quite amusing that they're saying this. It's to help shopkeepers. So shopkeepers matter, but barkeepers don't.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, as well as even like the 2-week waiting, right? When they announced it wasn't quite 2 weeks, it was 11 days or something when they first announced it. So it was like the virus was okay for 11 days. It's okay to go to the shop. Right now, I can go to the shop without a mask. But by next Friday, I believe, it would not be okay for me to go with a mask. Do you want to add anything there, Steve, to just the general nonsense of the whole thing to begin with?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would imagine that most of the people listening tonight are of like mind with us. But for anyone who isn't, I think it's quite obvious and it's quite important to point out that the masks are nonsense. As Phil just said, if there was a serious threat from, well, they say that the masks are to protect against, like a spit as opposed to exhalation. From that, then they would have implemented this sooner. And when you argue about masks with people, one of the things that they'll come back with, the people who are pro the masks, that is, say that if you're asymptomatic or whatever, the masks stop you from spreading the disease rather than you receiving this so-called virus. But the World Health Organization has recently been coming out saying that now believe that it's airborne. So, to believe that a mask is going to prevent you from exhaling this virus through some material, because obviously, if that were the case, then you wouldn't be able to breathe the oxygen, the other way around. So as Aedric just said, any way you look at this, there's inconsistencies, there's contradictions, there's just nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. That's why we don't want to focus too much on this. And like I say, we have done some like pretty decent documentaries, I believe, in our back catalogue if you walk through. And we have discussed some of this before, so we don't really want to overdo that part of this discussion. But I'm just to try and tee us into this, I'm going to show some articles and some of the stuff that's been going around on Twitter, just to try and lead us into this, how people essentially who object. I mean, here's an exact title. I'll give it now as I send it through. People who object to face masks voted Brexit. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole article here, but basically a caller called in, and as I'm going to show, this is a common thought between left-wing or people that are more susceptible to left-wing ideas. the people that that object to face masks voted Brexit, and some of the reasons this guy gives are because we're emotionally unintelligent, we're emotionally immature, we don't care about anybody else, we're selfish, etc., etc. They go on a long list, and like I'm going to show now. I mean, there's absolutely loads of tweets about this. You know, all that Brexit's energy had to go somewhere. For a while, it was a fetish for slavery statues. Now it's their inalienable right to spread to the disease. Now, I'll go through a few more while we're talking, but what I want to point out about this, how the discussion has completely moved from the scientific, right? They're not talking to us about statistics or facts. Now it's you're just selfish and you probably voted Brexit. It's again, and this helps us break into the psychology of it a little bit, right? We've got this idea that you're the morally better for wearing a mask. And this is the same thing that runs through the Black Lives Matter, etc., etc. It's this moral high ground. It's become the mask is now a status symbol, right? I proudly wear this mask because I'm morally superior to that guy over there who's a selfish Brexiter. I don't want to take up too much of the time here, so I'll pass it out now. But this is just to show a little bit of the mentality we're dealing with here. So, Aedric, have you got anything to say there, mate?
Yeah, I was going to say we're seeing some positive reinforcement as well with regards to the mask wearing and social distancing. When you see articles saying things like people who social distance may be more intelligent, that's been one of my favorite ones at the moment. They're describing how those who comply with social distancing guidelines have better work and memory capacity, which is an indicator of intelligence. Now, what you kind of see, and when you look at the two pieces of that puzzle, is that, well, there's negative and positive reinforcement going on, and they're obviously using that in order to try and garner support for the measures that they're putting in place. There's a study that I want to talk about a little bit tonight, but I would like to let Steed say what he's got to say on this kind of thing before I get into that. There is a lot of sort of crowd psychology and behavioral science stuff that they're thinking about in the background in order to try and go about gaining public approval, or as we sort of referred to it in the documentary that you and Rish made a while back, engineering or manufacturing consent.
Yeah, I mean, I'll drop in there.
Yeah, go for it.
It fascinates me, and you know, I'll probably pose this as more of a question. Fascinates me that the kind of people who will say that this conservative government are the greatest evil that they've seen in many years, or for some of them their entire lifetime, are also the kind of people that will unconditionally trust every single word that both government and the government mouthpiece of the media utter. And I've still not been able to get fully to grips with why that is. It's it's a strange thing. I mean, it's a huge subject, and I know that Aedric's been doing some research into crowd psychology, as you just mentioned, and things. So he's probably got more to say on this than me. But it's essentially we're dealing with people who unconditionally believe every single word that they're told. And yet, at the same time, they'll claim to be the underdogs. They'll claim to be the anti-establishment position. But there's absolutely no questioning from them. None of them will question anything that the so-called officials come out with, and certainly not. They've certainly got no concern over what the long-term ramifications of these slights on civil liberty might be. I think for a lot of them, there's a certain kind of naivety where they do believe that if we wear masks for a few weeks, then by the end of the year, everything can go back to normal. That everyone can go to their coffee bars, their craft beer bars, their concerts, whatnot. Whereas I think people like us three, and I dare say a lot of people listening, will realize and realize the moment that this pandemic landed, that there's no going back, or as far as those in control, those in charge of this, as far as they're concerned, there is no going back from this.
I was actually looking at an article earlier today. Oh, it wasn't an article. It was one of those sort of, it looks like an article on the BBC, but when you open it, it's just a video. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like nothing on the page besides a video. But it looks, in terms of how it's presented, like an article. It was one about how the handshake needs to never come back because not only does it spread the coronavirus, this whatever virus they're talking about, it spreads other viruses too. So, you know, the last however many 100 years or probably more that people have been shaking hands, that's now out the window in the interest of public health. And, you know, when you talk about slight affront and things like that, it's kind of almost it's both frightening and amusing in a way. And the way that they're talking about some of this stuff, it's almost, you know, to do with this whole new normal and things like that. But that was one that stood out to me today. The handshake should never come back. And actually, the woman who was talking about this on the BBC is a woman going by the name of Susan Michie. And actually, she contributed along with a few other authors to an article, not an article, sorry, a study for SAGE, which is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, currently advising the UK government on what to do with regards to social distancing measures and how to approach this COVID-19 scenario. She's also a member of the COVID-19 Behavioural Science Advisory Group. And looking at this paper, it does shed some light on what kind of things that, you know, we're seeing now in how people are responding to this this pandemic, or whatever you want to call it. So this article is called "Reducing SARS-CoV-2 Transmission in the UK." A behavioural science approach to identifying options for increasing adherence to social distancing and shielding vulnerable people. In a nutshell, it goes through a number of different ways in which the government can go about encouraging the desired response from the public. If they want people to social distance, how can they go about attaining that? And when you go through this paper, I can send the link to Phil, maybe he can put it up on the screen. But when you go through this paper, there's a few tables included that talk you through a number of different measures that could be enacted, and whether or not they're, one, sort of feasible, two, they're practical, three, they're effective, four, affordable, whether there's any spillover effects and what the equity ramifications would be. And some of these are: use media to increase sense of personal threat, use media to increase sense of responsibility to others, tailor the messaging, use and promote social approval for desired behaviours, consider enacting legislation to compel required behaviours. I'll just pause on that one for 1 second, actually, because I do want to say this paper was first written in sort of the end of April, so it was before we seen the mandated wearing of these masks coming in a few days. So it is quite likely that it was influential on the adoption of that approach. The next one after that is consider use of social disapproval for failure to comply. As you can see, the intention with this whole virus situation is to try and shame people, as well as reinforce good behaviour, let's say, in those who have complied already, to try and go about attaining this. And I would say that I don't think this will end with the masks, but will go on to vaccinations and things like that in the future as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this coercion in some of the tweets that I showed people there. A lot of them go through this idea of selfishness. This idea that if you don't wear, as I've already mentioned, but there was one in particular. I mean, some of this. I mean, even here they call it gammon, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but according to the Tory gammon, we were going to be world leaders in most things post Brexit. Think I'm finding we lead nobody exception of COVID-19 European death rate, and we simply follow. So there we're just being abused, but there's been a lot of this about, especially in this article, I think. I mean, you're probably going to struggle to see this. He says it's not even a direct refusal. They lack emotional capacity to get over the inconvenience and actually do the right thing. They lack the empathy to be able to see this is better for everyone if done universally and done properly. So we're seeing some of the things that Aedric was talking about there playing out in real time, essentially, right? Right, Aedric? That's how they're going
Yeah,
to manipulate by using these,
exactly.
by using these kind of examples.
Yeah, I
Um,
think it's worth pointing out as well when it comes to those kinds of things how frustrating it is for the three of ourselves here, as well as probably most of the people in the chat or listening to this. How well, I guess it depends on what your stance on things is, but if it's anything like mine, it's frustrating that this comes from the baseline assumption every single time that this virus is indeed highly pathogenic and it is indeed taken many lives unexpected. Um, there does not actually appear to be any real scientific sort of steady scientific evidence to suggest that that is in fact the case, and yet it goes on and on and on. Anyway, you were saying this yourself earlier, Phil, that the sort of discussion seems to be getting reframed now
mhm.
from being about the scientific argument and being more about be a good person and do what you should do. Don't be scaring other people or putting them at risk or making them feel uncomfortable or whatever. I actually seen that when it comes to these masks, they didn't use the term that the language of saving lives when they described it on the sort of .gov website. I think it was Matt Hancock's sort of public address type thing a few days back now. They literally said that it's about making other shoppers feel more safe and comfortable with going shopping. Crazy.
Well, that's part of this cancel culture, right? That we're experiencing in the West at the moment as well. This idea that if you suddenly your liberties affect everybody else. We know this is true to a point, but what they're trying to phrase it here that if you offend somebody, if somebody's offending, then that's your fault because of what you said. If you're not wearing a mask, then you're putting other people in danger. It's this idea that if you want to express yourself in any way, you're hindering or harming others. So it's part of this cancel culture that you've got to go along with what they say, or that's when the tolerant become intolerant, right? As soon as these completely tolerant people, as soon as you say to one of these completely tolerant people that you've got a different opinion and you've got a different way of living your life, etc., you're suddenly the baddie. You're suddenly the now become the almost mythical Nazi, right?
Oh,
Yeah, carry on, Steve.
the principles of people like James O'Brien and his kind of his following,
Mm-hmm.
the principles that they have are handed to them by the mainstream media, and they're extremely base level principles of no one must get hurt, no one must get killed, no
Uh-huh.
one must get offended. They lack the ability to long-term higher principles that people in the nationalist movement have, of trying to preserve these kind of timeless values that our ancestors had,
Mm-hmm.
and going back into the mists of history, these timeless values, which I think all of us are trying to hold on to. That's certainly one of the things that drives me, is trying to not allow that flame to dwindle, that flame to go out. These timeless, eternal principles and values, which need to be preserved into the distant future for all of time. But people like James O'Brien, they don't even recognize these values, let alone feel any need to preserve them.
Mm-hmm.
As far as they're concerned, everything for grabs, everything is fair game to be criticized, torn down, dismantled. I mean, when you look at it that way, it's actually can be described as just a very Marxist point of view.
It's like the laws of man versus something greater. If you don't have any higher ideal with which you're going to strive towards, then you're susceptible to anything. It's kind of like being caught naked without a sword and a shield. It's like anything that gets thrown your way, any figure of authority or anything else that tells you what you should or shouldn't think, you're going to be susceptible to that because you don't have any higher sort of orient and principle towards which.
It's a really good saying, isn't it? If you don't stand for something or for anything.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's part of the attack, and it stems this. Like you say, it is a very communist idea, but it also is based in this idea of safety. I mean, this is really good and really shown with the COVID and the masks, but it's also shown with these ideas of safe spaces that now so-called minorities are going to be given. Even in workplaces, people are pushing for this, that these people have safe spaces, that these people get everything. This idea of safety, right? That people must have. Now, obviously, societies came together originally as safety. It was a group of people that agreed to a certain amount of laws for their safety. But this was from an outside threat. Now, these people, because they're outsiders and will always be outsiders, they are being touted as people that are prone to attack, even though we did a video, Media Lives Matter, where we try and show this as the opposite. But because they are prone, or the media is telling us that these people are suffering from racism, suffering from X, Y, and Z, that they need safety. And it's the same with the cancel culture. This is offending somebody. This is it. And this idea of safety is in. So, and to relate it to your point, Steed, it's like these ancient values of freedom, of the idea of self-responsibility, the things that made Europe great, right? The things that made this country, the UK, a leader in many ways, in many parts of the world, they're now obsolete, right? We need to get rid of those and get everybody into this idea that the state is going to make them safe. And this is a point that I wanted to bring up too, in relation to people that still doubt this COVID thing. And I've got a quote up there that I'll read in a minute. But, I mean, the government at the moment is trying to take full control for your safety. Now, I don't know about you or anybody listening, but I'm pretty certain that most of us listening realize that the government is probably the last place we're going to look right now for our safety, as them, along with the media, who we're going to get on to in a bit as well, are, in my opinion, inciting violence against us at this point by their constant lies and inversion of reality. And Aedric, you want to jump in there, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the sales pitch is that they're doing this for our safety, but the reality of what they're doing it for is probably not our safety at all. You know, as we were saying earlier, and as most people in this chat, most people listening to this are probably feel similarly themselves. Even if you do believe that there is something to this virus, there is little evidence to suggest it's particularly dangerous. It's any more of a threat than anything else. So the sales pitch is that it's all for our safety, but the reality is that it's about the attainment of their 2030 Sustainable Development Goals and working towards a one world sort of centralized bureaucracy.
Yeah, sorry, if I can just jump in.
Yeah, sure.
I think that can be proven quite easily by the basic fact that no one is allowed to opt out. You know, it's rather kind of, you know, the kind of presumption that those who are fearful of this should remove themselves from social situations or wear a mask or take a vaccination or anything like that. They're not giving those of us who would choose freedom over safety and security. They're not giving us the option to opt out of this. It's a completely totalitarian move, the whole thing. And as Aedric just said, it's about this great reset, this 2030 agenda, ushering us into this new society. And the way I see it, the masks are part of an initiation ritual. You know, they're there to destroy the ego temporarily, so that we can be more easily ushered into this new society that they've got ready waiting for us.
Well, it's like the handshakes things as well. You know, talking the article I mentioned earlier, or video rather, I mentioned earlier about, you know, the handshake should never come back. If you were to look at this wearing of masks as being a kind of initiation, it extends beyond that alone, and it goes all the way into the realms of, keeping people apart entirely, physical interaction, emotional interaction, everything. I mean, obviously they've got all this stuff about how you need to be using the internet and that to talk to each other, and stay in touch using, I don't know, FaceTime or whatever it is that people use for doing that. But they're trying really hard to separate people physically from one another. Now, I
Yes.
know that if there is a deadly virus going about, then that would be logical. However, once again, it does come back to the fact that that does not appear to be the case. And therefore, what is it that they're going for? If the masks are like some kind of initiation ritual, I do believe that they're trying to keep us physically separated in as many ways as possible. And I do think that that's why they want to stamp out things like shaking hands and all that nonsense.
I don't know if either of you guys saw, but Wales have apparently banned talking on mobile phones on public transport, or they've discussed it anyway. And I can't really think of any really good reason for that, other than to, again, it's another way of separating people. When you're speaking to someone over the phone, voice, but there's a more human aspect to that than there is typing a digital message across a smartphone on WhatsApp or whatever. I just think it's another layer of human interaction that they're trying to remove.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of points hit on there, guys. But like I say, for anybody that's doubting, because sometimes, I mean, one of the reasons that we that I wanted to bring these subjects up on Mimirs Council, and why I got Steed and Aedric to join me on some of these shows, is because I'm sorry about that. It's not COVID, I promise. But now, one of the reasons I got these guys on was because there's a bit of in the pro-white circles, the whatever you want to call them, there's a bit of a fear of touching on some of this, what is normally considered like old school conspiracy. That somehow that there's some kind of new agenda, like the Agenda 2030 now, which was the Agenda 2020 essentially. It's the same thing, it's just being rehashed a little bit. But look, I wanted to get to this quote, and I'll get it out of the way while I'm here. But just to show that this is about protection, or the falsity of protection, and it ties into the conspiratorial type areas. And I'm not saying all the conspiracies are correct, or even that every one of them based in anything, but there is something to some of this work. Because this report here that I'm going to read, that you can see on your screen, has been on there for a bit, was written in 2010 and was funded by the Global Business Network and the Rockefeller Foundation. And it says, so this was written 10 years ago, and it says, China's government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks. Just to note here that they were doing that with some of the apps and places. They were doing some cameras they'd set up for body temperature checks. At the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, which we're seeing now, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck, and even intensified. In order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics to transnational terrorism to environmental crisis and rising poverty, leaders around the world took a firmer grip on power. Now, when we break that down, I mean, look at what they're saying at the end there. Pandemics, we've got one. Transnational terrorism, that's all around us. Environmental crisis, well, who can forget the climate change big push last year with the child as the speaker for it. Rising poverty, well, that's going to start to come. It's already in much of the world, but it's going to start to come in the West now as our shops, because of things like these measures about masks and lockdowns, are starting to close down. But this was written 10 years ago. And this was a prediction of the future. It was showing a possibility. Yeah. So we're seeing this possibility almost word for word come into being. And when we couple this with the anti-white sentiment coming from our governments and media, we're starting to see that the future looks bleak unless we tackle both of these problems together. Would you agree, guys, that these two, the future of the West, because this is where this is playing out. This is where this is playing out the hardest. Especially now,
100%.
yeah, we're seeing Black Lives Matter as well, where whites are having to give away everything, as I say, the victim. The invader is coming in, demanding that all they want is to live peaceably, then demanding that they be treated special, that we give them everything that we have earned and our ancestors have earned over hundreds of generations. And not only that, that we admit and accept that we are completely racist, and if you are white, you're racist as default, and white people can be the only people that are racist, even though we are the countries that allowed them in when they called for help in many cases for asylum seekers, etc. So when we put these two things together, we see the future world turning into, as we say there, the predictions there are pretty accurate. So we can, when they say after, even after the pandemic has faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified. What we're seeing now is what they've been phrasing the new normal, right? And the new normal does include this highly pushed racial politics that's going on, and it's been forced down our throats whether you want it or not. And this is something I mentioned on a live stream I did over at Mimirs Brunner. It doesn't matter what your position is anymore. If you are white and you're not with us, they're coming for you. End of. And one of their ways to attack you is with this, because as we're going to go into a bit of the psychology, and I'll get into that in a minute, people like us are generally more free thinking. We generally assess the situation a little bit more, and we value certain independence and freedoms. Anyway, guys, before I carry on rambling, I want to throw it over if anybody's got any points on what I've said there.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
If we look at this let's look at this from a nationalist perspective. So nationalists are, we're dissidents. We're scattered around whichever country we're from. Most of us probably don't know that many people in our immediate vicinity who think like us. So we come to the internet. We use the internet to try and network, to learn from other people. Then look what's happening now with YouTube, Twitter. The banning, the shadow banning, it's just outright banning these days. So we say in response to that, we might say, okay, well, we need to build a real world movement. But let's not forget that just on the back of this coronavirus nonsense, we've now got updates on iPhones and Android phones, which are for track and trace. We've got now, when you go to a pub, you've got to leave your name and address. There are various hobbies who are trying to get encrypted messaging removed. Probably all of this, we're probably going to have digital currency in the next few years, certainly proposed, where all of our transactions, all of our bank balances, our purchases and everything will be overseen, if not controlled. So from a nationalist point of view, this is a disaster. And as far as I am concerned, one of the things that this was specifically designed to do was to quell any potential nationalist uprising in any Western country. So it amazes me that there are still big nationalist names out there. I'm not going to bother naming any now, but I'm not sure if they're still holding the same position, but they certainly were saying initially, this is a good thing. We need to support the state. This is about having a big, powerful state. This is, all of this kind of stuff. And that's short-sighted beyond belief.
Yeah, I think
Aedric?
I think part of the failure of that perspective is the fact that they're missing that this is not like a strong government. I mean, the UK, what's going on in the UK, it differs only marginally from what's going on in France, which differs only marginally from what's going on in the US, which differs only marginally from so on and so on ad nauseum. What we're actually seeing is the consolidation of power on an international scale of corporations and their integration with government. So, where it's leading and where it's what you were talking about a moment ago, Steed, regarding sort of privacy and how it's going to result in, everything being tracked and traced and things like that everywhere. I do think that that is leading us towards effectively everywhere being administrative regions of a central bureaucracy. And I think that's what the kind of 2030 agenda is. It was funny listening to Phil read out the 2010 Operation Lockstep stuff from what was it called? It's what are they called? The such and such foundation, the Rockefeller
Rockefeller,
Foundation.
yeah.
Yeah, that's it. This is the thing Phil was reading a moment ago. It's still on the screen. It ends with, in order to protect themselves from the spread of increasingly global problems, from pandemics and transnational terrorism to environmental crises, and it's gone now, something else. I was looking at a paper. I mean, listen to this quote. This is the end of a different paper. All in all, it is a good life, much better than the path we were on. Where it became so clear that we could not continue with the same model of growth. We had all these terrible things happening: lifestyle diseases, climate change, the refugee crisis, environmental degradation, completely congested cities, water pollution, air pollution, social unrest and unemployment. We lost way too many people before we realized we could do things differently. That's the end of an article from the World Economic Forum called Welcome to 2030. There's that year again. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better. And what that article goes into is effectively the plan for setting up smart cities, sort of centralized smart cities and things like that. And I think ultimately that is where all of this is leading. I think it's leading towards what they would consider to be, well, it's almost like Cloud and Hove Kalergi plan, kind of the race, the European race of the future will be brown sort of thing, sort of tan
Yes.
or whatever they said. I think what they want is this world of slaves, sort of grey, soulless, boring, miserable slaves.
No
and in a
expectations
small-
of privacy or anything. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Everything's monitored. And if you read that article, I'll put the link. I don't think it'll let me put it in the chat for people, but if you just search, "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, have no privacy, and life has never been better," you'll find it, and it is quite frightening what they're sort of talking about here. And with regards to people like ourselves and where we could end up in that future, I'm going to read another little quote from that. "My biggest concern is all the people who do not live in our city, those we lost on the way, those who decided that it became too much, all this technology, those who felt obsolete and useless when robots and AI took over parts of our jobs, big parts of our jobs, those who got upset with the political system and turned against it. They live different kind of lives outside of the city. Some have formed little self-supplying communities, others just stayed in the empty and abandoned houses in small 19th century villages." Now, that doesn't actually sound as bad to me as the kind of future that these people do, in fact, describe when they talk about their complete and total lack of privacy and everything being automated and digitized. But it is sort of worth pointing out that if things do continue down the path that they are currently going down, in which people such as ourselves face removal from the public space, whether it's on YouTube or wherever else, removal from online digital sort of currency platforms, PayPal and things like that, means of acquiring income online, and whatever else, it is going to come to the day in which we face some kind of expulsion from society. And as time goes forwards, it may actually come to the point in which we have to consider how we respond to things from the outside in. I think we're on the precipice at the moment of things changing very rapidly and beyond control, and we need to think about how to do something quickly at the moment, because this is, with this coronavirus thing and this Black Lives Matter thing and sort of the events of this year, it's really obvious that things are accelerating exponentially. And in fact, the UN has been calling this decade their decade of action towards attaining the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So it does certainly look at the moment as though what they intend to achieve by 2030 to 2050, which is probably a window that a lot of people here are familiar with and have already thought about themselves. But this is definitely not about a virus, and this new normal is gonna extend into the future.
Yeah, I mean, just to speak to the little thing that they said there about this kind of almost idealistic setting for the people that didn't go along, as Steed mentioned earlier, and as we've shown here, there is no opt out. There's no opt out of Black Lives Matter. There's no opt out of the coronavirus. There is no opt out. Everybody must go along with the media, essentially, and how the media portray things, and they twist and turn it. And as I've said, even if you think that COVID-19 is a serious threat, you're lumped in with us. They want, so we can see their disposition from all the tweets that they're lumping people that don't want to wear masks with people that voted Brexit, with people that disagree with Black Lives Matter, with people that don't accept everything that's coming out of this climate change, as we know, because what are all these things aimed at? They're all aimed at Western nations with majority white populations. This has been seen. Now, as Aedric said earlier, this will eventually roll out to everybody. But we were talking a little bit before the show about what it is, and I just want to touch on this, especially before we round up. What it is that makes these people so susceptible, and what it is that makes us not so susceptible to these ideas, and why we're being rounded up as the baddies, and why, in the main, we're all in agreement with this. And like I said, Edric made a point before we came on that, white nations historically are nations where people value certain freedoms, as Steve was pointing out too, and we're more likely to resist this new system, so we have to be removed. This is why they're flooding our countries with immigrants to cause the division, and then they're flooding our young's minds, and then through the media enforcing that the idea to separate us up, essentially, to divide us. These are constantly divisions, so we're weakened and susceptible, because there's no way, if you went back, say, 100 years, that anybody would accept any of this nonsense from their government. Countries like America, for example, where freedom it's almost a running meme with the Americans. They would never accept anything like this, but we're seeing them accepting it because we're seeing them cave into public pressure. And before I throw it over, one of the biggest powers they have is not just the education, not just the media, but once they've got you convinced, they push you into this corner that you've accepted the con, and this is the trick of the con, or the art of the con, that our governments pursue. So once they get you to wear a mask for work or wear a mask for here, what you do is then deep down that you've submitted, even if you disagreed with it before. So when somebody takes the mickey out of you for doing it or brings it up, you then defend it. And one of the best examples of this, without derailing too much, just as an example, is circumcision in the US. It's absolutely common practice for everybody to get circumcised in the US, regardless of it having no health benefits and no aesthetic benefits, no benefits at all, period. But why is it so prevalent? Because they managed to convince one generation, and then that one generation started to say, well, if it was good for me, it's good for the next generation. And once they've circumcised their own children, they are so committed to that lie that if they admit to themselves for 1 second that they've been duped, they have to admit that they've harmed their children. They're not going to do that. You cannot convince that person then to do it. In some cases you can, but in the main, you will not convince them to change their minds. And as we go further down this road with COVID, as they convince us to take another step, and as we back off and say, well, I just want to focus on pro-white, and I don't think this is going to help us, as we just let it go and let it roll, soon we'll be justifying our own enslavement, just like those people that justify the mutilation of their child's genitalia because it happened to them. Sorry about that, bit of a rant there, guys. So anybody want to jump in with something there?
It was a good one, but I was just going to say you can apply exactly the same thing to vaccinations.
Mm-hmm.
I
Exactly.
mean, Phil's a father like I am, and you try telling a fellow parent getting their child vaccinated wasn't a good idea. You don't get met with wrath like that very often, because no one wants to hear that they may have done the wrong thing by their children.
Exactly.
So the fact that the last few generations in the Western world have routinely vaccinated their children, now when we have this potential worldwide vaccination program that they're going to try and roll out, most people are just by default in favor of it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I think there's a way of putting that. I actually mentioned this earlier before we went live. I don't know who said it or where I got it from, but it's the simple idea that it's easier to fool somebody than to convince them that they've been fooled. I think there's a bit of ego sort of called into question when you say to someone, "You've been fooled, you were tricked, the things that you were told to believe are not correct, and there was somebody pulling the strings and manipulating you." Nobody wants to hear that
But
because
there's also a point there that your defiance alone, not even if you tell them what to do, as Steed was trying to say there, when I say, because my children are not vaccinated, when I say to somebody, my children are not vaccinated, they instantly get defensive of why they vaccinated. And they instantly want to attack my position. I haven't tried to push my position on them, but it becomes an instant to them. Deep down, they might go, well, I don't know if they might have doubts. Now, I don't want to force them to do anything they don't want to do, and that's fine. I don't. If they want to vaccinate children, I wish they wouldn't, but I'm not going to tell them otherwise. But just my stance that I didn't pushes them to defense, pushes them to, in some cases, attack. They aggressively then say that you're an idiot. I'm an idiot because I didn't do what they did, and we're seeing the same methodology here. You're an idiot if you want to agree with Brexit. You're an idiot if you don't want to wear a mask. If you don't believe in Black Lives Matter, you're an idiot. You're always a selfish idiot. It doesn't matter what the story is, what the angle is. People in our positions are always selfish idiots, according to them. Obviously, we're not.
That these people have been raised by a culture that tells them not to strive for freedom, not to strive for physical greatness, not to strive for beauty, not to strive for morality. So these people have become comfortable in a society where they don't have to lift a finger. They can essentially kind of swan through life, making very little effort, and be told that they're great, they're part of the progressive future. So when someone comes along who's a bit of a kind of vestige of the old ways, who does care about their physical well-being, who doesn't vaccinate, who has a strong set of morals, who has spiritual belief, who is beautiful, just the existence of that person becomes offensive to the person who doesn't have any of that.
For sure.
Yeah. I think whilst we're talking about sort of how people are influenced by the information that's sort of all around them and things like that, they're sort of, they don't create their own thoughts and opinions necessarily. It's sort of imposed upon them by a culture and a media. I've got this little quote here. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of a country. We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by a relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind, who harness old social forces and contrive new ways to bind and guide the world. And that quote is by Edward Bernays, everyone's favourite father of public relations / propaganda, who was incidentally the nephew or double nephew, as we talked about earlier, of Sigmund Freud, and was in fact the uncle of Mark Randolph as well, who was the co-founder and former CEO of Netflix. I think in the last 100 years or so, since the advent of mass media and these new forms of communication and new forms of propaganda as they came about with social media and things like that more recently, people have been inundated more than ever before with this constant slew of information. There's a Savitri Devi quote actually where she was talking about how times were better when people read less and thought more. And there's kind of some elements of that at play in society at the moment. The same guy whose quote I've just read out, Bernays, he said something really ugly about the way in which the media does this. And he said words hammer continuously at the eyes and ears of America. Obviously, he was an American. Well, he was Austro. Well, I'm not sure who he was from actually, but he was a big influential figure in the United States. Those of you who are not familiar with the guy, he did in fact work with a number of different big businesses in the US, General Electric, Liggett and Myers, who made Chesterfield ciggies. He went over to American Tobacco, CBS.
Yeah, he
He's
got
worked with
the he actually got the suffragettes in America to
yeah,
smoke
Freedom
cigarettes. To smoke
Freedom
cigarettes.
Towers or
Yeah.
something.
Smoke
Yeah.
cigarettes for public relations, and he actually did the public relations for the
Exactly,
suffragettes as well. He essentially made popular feminism, or the first wave of it.
Yeah, and he was a CIA guy, and he also worked with what was the race one back in the early 20th century in the US? I can't actually remember the name of it. It's like the AAPC or something like that. It's kind of similar acronym to APAC, but it's got nothing to do with that, I don't think. But yeah, he was a big influential figure, and I think it's worth pointing out that we have since sort of the beginning of the 20th century, we have entered this new age of information and people being constantly bombarded with information. I don't think it's necessarily the case that most people should be subject to that kind of thing. I think, a lot of people should just be left to get on with their lives and get by. And a big part of the problem that we're seeing now is this overexposure to potentially dangerous, if not dangerous, then definitely manipulative information. And people are being coerced into thinking things. And we're seeing that at the moment with it kind of brings it back to the masks and things like that. I think that is what we're seeing. Some people are more susceptible to this than others, this kind of mass manipulation. And that's a difficult conversation because, well, for one, I haven't really thought about it in enough detail. You can say, there are people who are NPCs and then player characters, and that kind of meme from 2018, 19, whenever it was that people were saying that, or whatever else. I'd need to think about it more. But for some reason, there are some people who are more susceptible to this than others, and we'll say, it's like the left wing, for example. I'm not even sure it necessarily is. I think it's left wing ideals, left wing politics, or progressive, let's say, politics, because it's not like economically left politics or anything like that. It's specifically about social justice and whatever else when it comes to things like race and sexuality. I don't think people necessarily have truly heartfelt beliefs with regards to those things. Some people do, but I think the vast majority of people who we see whipped up in this crowd, they just kind of believe what they're told to believe by these words that are constantly hammering their eyes and their ears. And the difficult thing for people on our side of things is that ultimately comes down to power and who has the power to amplify their words, and we do not. So it's very difficult for us to properly mobilize, and that's going to be a problem that in the next 10 years, well, the next year or 5, we're really going to have to address on our side of things. Otherwise, it might sadly be game over. We can't let that happen. I do believe that what is going on in the world right now is evil and is leading towards something evil. And I do think that our side of things is in the right fundamentally at the end. So we can't lose. It's just a question of how on earth do we deal with all of the world's corporate and governmental powers, and NGOs and things like that as well, sort of combined into this big like hammer. Do you know?
Mm-hmm. Oh, what they're doing is inverting reality. We see it everywhere. As you said, COVID death rates, all these rates are non-existent. I mean, you'll find higher mortality rates in the 2000 flu, but nobody remembers that, or the 1990 flu has even higher mortality rates. But you won't remember it, even though I was alive for both of them. It never even made. It might have made a segment on the news that there was a particularly bad flu that year, but what they want to do is invert reality. We have to have all these shit. The same with Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. Black people are the constant victims, right? Of violence and attacks. When we know the complete opposite is true, and the statistics show it. As I said with COVID, and just to point out, Bernays, the group you were talking about is the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. where
Yeah, I just seen that in the chat actually. So thanks
yeah, I
to
put
the
up a little the wiki. It's from the wiki page, but it's the first place I found it when I searched. But I just put it
yeah.
up there just to show Bernays.
It's interesting that Bernays was first on the whole ethnic minority thing and on the feminist thing as well. Very early days.
He put a lot of effort. I mean, yeah, he was good at what he did. His daughter even hates him. You can actually see an interview with her that because he believed fundamentally, he was a Jewish man, by the way, and he believed fundamentally that if people were stupid enough to fall for it, and he's quoted as saying something similar to this. I'm going to butcher the quote, but basically, if people are stupid enough to fall for it, then they deserve it, no matter what it leads to. So if it leads to the destruction of your people, if you're an idiot enough to buy it, then that's your fault. Now we've got to remember that this guy helped the NAACP, helped feminism. Everything he touched was not good for us, and everything he touched is being used against us now. But judging by his own statements, if you're stupid enough to believe it, even he doesn't believe what he's telling you. He just knows it's effective. Right, and sorry, Steve, have you got anything to add there? Because I know Aedric just had a bit of a rant, and so did I. So
No, it was good. They were both good. Important ideas there. I mean, what I would add is when people, for example, the BBC came out, I think yesterday or the day before, or something, admitting that the death toll figures aren't reliable because they've been counting. Someone will go into hospital, discharged, and then die of something completely unrelated or
yeah,
proven. Then it gets counted as a COVID-19 death. You know, we know that these kind of games have been played.
yeah,
But people in our sphere will question, well, why is he hitting that? Why are we seeing so many articles which are and so many alternate points of view? If you look for them, why are we allowed to see them? And I can't help but wonder whether part of all of this, both the coronavirus thing and the Black Lives Matter thing, is trying to almost dismantle the individual minds of the masses to the extent where they can present conflicting or obvious mistruths, but still people buy into it. And Drick was mentioning a friend of his is having a bit of a tough time because some friends of theirs are demanding that this person wear a mask in order to be involved with certain social situations, even though they're admitting none of this adds up. They're admitting that none of this makes sense. There's no justification for forcing people to wear masks. They're prepared to do it, and furthermore, they're prepared to enforce it upon others through social pressure.
yeah.
And I think this is part of the new society that and the initiation that they're trying to implement is to reprogram us to no longer expect logic and reason to be paramount in any kind of
Go along to get along.
application.
Right? I mean, the thing, just one point here, Adrian, can I jump to you? But the thing is here, right, people don't understand. They might go, well, it's just a mask, right? But then it just becomes something else. How long before, say, they bring in a vaccination? It's just a vaccine, right? And then say corporations decide to work there, you've got to have this vaccine. So then somebody that's out of work goes to sign on the dole, as it would be in the UK, or universal credit as it is now. And they go, well, you haven't got a vaccine, so you're not actually prepared to work. So you can't get any social aid. Yeah. So what it becomes is one step leads to another step. And before we know it, we've given away every right to resist. And then when they want to force down our throats anything, I mean, we've got to understand as well with vaccines, something I wanted to mention earlier, that vaccines are forced medication. So whether you agree with vaccines or disagree with vaccines, do you believe that the person has the right to refuse medication? If you believe they do, then you should be pro-choice where vaccines are concerned. Because, as I've mentioned before, the only people that are force medicated are criminals and the insane. And unless you're one of those, do you want to force it on somebody else? Now, we're being tied up, as we see with a lot of these tweets and that I showed earlier, we're being called insane for our beliefs on Black Lives Matter, for our beliefs on climate change, for our beliefs on Brexit, for our beliefs on anything. And that's where they go. But they're trying to get these things in to slowly push us into a position where we cannot resist, where they will ban this show because, well, we said something that they disagree with medically. We said something that they disagreed with politically. We said something, whatever. And we're seeing this, as we know, with YouTube censorship as it is. But this is the place they're pushing us into, where we will have no voice. And soon it will be illegal to not have a voice. It will be illegal to refuse medication. And that's not a future, pro-white or not, that's not a future I want for my children. Okay? So we must resist all of their attacks upon us and remain true to what we believe. Right, guys? And sorry, Aedric, I jumped in there and I just wanted to...
That's okay. It's okay. I was just going to say, regarding what Steed was saying a moment ago about a friend of mine, what they're going through is a sorry state of affairs, to be honest, because they're a bit of a, well, not even a bit really, they're full on what you would call a normie, I guess, and they're not switched on to anything really. They're just happy getting by with their life and doing what they do. But they've developed some concerns and suspicions regarding what's currently unfolding, and they're being subject to a very terrible example of what complacency and indifference combined with social pressure can achieve when it comes to, let's say, malicious governments or corporate powers going towards unsavory ends, let's say. So they've got friends who are saying to them, well, if you don't wear the mask, it's only a small compromise kind of thing. Just wear the mask and do it, because they don't want to do it. They don't want to do any of that. And they've said to themselves explicitly, I agree with you that none of this adds up. It seems very shady. It's very suspicious. But for the sake of getting life back to normal and getting things back to where they were ASAP, you just need to conform and go along with it. And well, when it comes to crowd psychology and things like that, that is sort of one of the key details in how they can go about achieving what they would want. We don't need to have the entire population of the United Kingdom or Europe or the United States or whatever necessarily stand up and say no. We would only actually need a fraction of the population of any one of those countries to do it, and we would be able to not necessarily halt this, considering the amount of money and the amount of power that's behind it, but certainly do a lot more than we are currently. And the problem is that so many people are so complacent, and you could go into how we've got there, because it has been a long slog to get people to be that complacent over the last 30 years of video games and porn and movies and whatever else.
Well, if I could just jump in there.
Go ahead.
I used to get in trouble in my early days being involved with nationalism for being a so-called conspiracy theorist. And it's only really in recent years where the nationalist and conspiracy kind of movements have coalesced, to a more, in my view, acceptable degree. But one of the reasons I think that it's so important to be open to the idea of this, researching these theories about what's going on at a hidden level, is because only when you see the bigger picture and you see that blueprint of where they have intended to take us, are you able to say, no, that's not okay, because masks leads to this, vaccinations leads to this, tracking leads to this, and you can see it mapped out in front of you. But if you're a nationalist who thinks that boomer conspiracies are retarded or whatever, like certain figures do, you're blind. You're kind of heading into the future without any concept of where the social globalist architects really want to take it. There's no chaos involved with what they're doing. It's very, very calculated. And I think it's well, as I say, I just think it's important that we see it from that perspective as well, because normies who think, oh, it's just a mask, it's just a vaccination, they might think that they can have one shot wear a mask for a few weeks, and then by 2021 they're going to be back to normal, going to their music festivals, going to the cinema, going to supermarkets unhindered, whatever. But we know, because of things like the Rockefeller Foundation paper that was read out earlier by Phil, because of that, because of the work that Bill Gates was doing with the Event 201 and things like that, we know that they have no intention of letting things go back to normal. So there's no point in compromising on things like masks, because they will only see each compromise that we make as a green light to push their agenda further.
Yeah, and I mean, they
Yeah.
wouldn't be calling their agenda for 2021 the Great Reset if they didn't have any intention on pushing things further. I think part of the problem with nationalist thinkers who fail to recognize what has unfortunately been called conspiracy theorizing, or whatever other terminology people want to use, if they don't acknowledge that, they're not well equipped to tackle the problems that we face. For example, when you talk about the white plight and racial issues in Europe and things like that, if you don't like understand what it is that they're going for, and why it is that they might want to reduce the white population, and why it is that they might want to disenfranchise us and leave us in a difficult situation, then all you will just sound like a racist. And I know that sounds to our listeners silly, but to lots of people, you are just going to sound like you're like, well, they're going to be like, well, why does it matter? I don't care. Why does it matter? But it's like, there is something happening. There is an end goal that they're trying to achieve. And it does require our disenfranchisement. It does require us to be displaced in our homelands. And they will not get what they want to get if they don't achieve that. And I think if you can point to what it is that they want to go for in the end, which is a centralized bureaucracy of effectively slaves working for a tiny, minute, very special class. And I'm sure you can all guess who they might be.
Well,
You're not
according
going
to Kudnoth Kalergi, it would be the Jewish people. I mean, he specifically stated that.
Yeah, well, yeah, he did actually. Exactly. And yeah, if you can't point that out, and you can't address what it is that they're trying to achieve, then to the average person, and to you don't have a solid foundation on which to make your arguments. They're just going to say why though? I don't care. I don't understand why you care, and things like that. And that is because people have been set up to be sort of nodular individuals who don't consider things on a transgenerational basis. They don't think about how it's going to affect their children, or their children's children, or your children, versus, because they might not want any, for example. They're not going to think about your children, or anything like that. It is just, well, it doesn't affect me. I don't care. You sound like a racist. So it's like, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot if you don't understand the big picture of what it is that they're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I got a few points to make there, but I mean, speaking to the person that just wants to go along to get along, right? So they're going to just have the vaccine, they're going to go to get to normal. Well, they're giving you a clue with the phrase "new normal" that things are not going to go back to what they wanted, right? They're not going to be able to go to their concerts. They're not going to be able to live the life that they lived before, because the world's changing. They're telling us this. Like you say, the 2030 reset. And Kudnoth Kalergi, who I mentioned there, I mean, he's great to understand this and why that they might be flooding our countries with immigrants, because he proposed that very idea to flood Europe with immigrants to turn us into a coffee-coloured race. I believe he said that were, in his opinion at least, similar to the ancient Egyptians. Although we know that now with modern science they probably didn't look like what he believed they did, but anyway, that was what he said. And the main reason for this, by the way, if you read some of his works, you'll note that he believed that he actually states that the European man is inherently pagan. He said that a Buddhist, an Asian Buddhist, was more Christian than a German Catholic. And he said that this paganism, this barbarianism, means that they could never be ruled. So they would have to be mixed out of existence so that they could get their global, international government. You can look up Kudnoth Kalergi and see that for yourself. That's what he says.
Yeah.
of interest.
Another guy who said a very similar thing was Maurice Samuel, who was a Zionist Jewish author who wrote a book called You Gentiles, which was specifically about European man and the nature of European man, how it differs from Jewish people, and from how the European man is fundamentally incompatible with their with their worldview and they with ours. That goes into quite some detail on how European man is fundamentally pagan. He doesn't talk about how that would need to be bred out, for example, because he is literally offering a description of the differences between European man and Jewish man. But I would say that's on this subject a very interesting read, as he does go into a lot of the fundamental spiritual differences and racial differences. But I would say the two are kind of intrinsically related between the two. And his conclusion is that European man is fundamentally pagan.
Yeah, it's this barbarian idea, and as we've pointed out with the Rockefellers, as you point out, Kunoff-Kalergi, etc., etc. What we see there is what we're seeing now is not accidental. Be it with the pandemic, be it with the Black Lives Matter, be it with the immigration. This is not an accident. And as Steve said earlier, this is not chaos. They've been talking about this for a very long time, and the two are intimately connected. Kunoff-Kalergi believed in, well, at that point, a united Europe. Well, what are we fighting against? Brexit, which is a false united Europe. He wanted everything to be under the same hat with this mixed race population. And at the same time, and then we've got Rockefellers talking. It's all about this overall power structure, is what I'm trying to say, that wants to dominate the world. And at the time of Kunoff-Kalergi and to a point at the time now, the European and the Western nations, all of the people, the European diaspora that are of America, Australia, and even parts of South Africa before it was destroyed. South Africa was one of the leading nations in many areas of science before it was destroyed deliberately by communists. It was overtaken by communists. We are the leaders and powerhouse of the world. So if you want to take over the world, what do you do first? There's a few things we can even bring in. The movement of manufacturing and the movement of all this of production to the east, as we could see that as a prerequisite, right? They first off move all the production to the east. Now they have to destroy the infrastructure of the west so they can get their world domination. We're talking about people that are that crazy, that's what they want. When they call people like myself a white supremacist, they miss the complete point of they miss the meaning of supremacist, as in supremacist means that I would wish to rule over other races. I'm an ethnic nationalist. I want the complete opposite of that. But they accuse me of that is because that's what they want. They want to rule over all. Anyway, lads, we're going to start winding the show up now. So I just want to make sure that both Steed and Aedric have got everything out that they wanted to say tonight. So I'll start with you, Aedric, then we'll get to Steed for the last word, and then we'll say goodnight. So is there anything you wanted to say that we've sadly forgotten?
Yeah, to be honest, there's probably a few things that I would say, but I'll think about it, and I think it's best waiting for next time. I've got quite a bit that I could probably say then, because I think Steed's got a few good. I think Steed's got a few good bits and pieces that he wanted to bring up at the end of this stream. So I think I'll pass it over to him and let him say what he's got to say. So yeah, for now I'll say thanks for talking and thanks for listening. Anyone who's in the chat and whatever else, and has a good evening.
Great to have you here, Aedric. So here you go, Steed. The weight's been put on your shoulders.
Cheers, Aedric. Yeah, I would say that it's really important to anyone listening to this to prepare your stance now. Know what your position is on everything that's to come. For example, I believe that masks are a deliberate inconvenience. They know that we don't like them. They know that we don't want to wear them. They also know that we're waiting for a vaccine. Most people are anyway. Anyone you talk to, oh, we only need to wear masks until there's a vaccine. We only need to do this until there's a vaccine. When the vaccine comes, I believe it will be consensual. It will be optional. But if you don't take it, then you'll have to continue wearing a mask, perhaps. And then those of us who refused to wear a mask or didn't want to wear a mask will then be, it will be inverted. We'll be the ones having to wear it. We'll be the ones marked out as these social pariahs. And given the kind of media and social pressure, we'll almost be kind of figuratively spat upon in public. But speaking for myself, and I think this also goes for Aedric and Phil as well, and hopefully for many of you listening, I've already made my peace with that. It will be that person, and I am ready to meet the kind of the ire of people out in public who see me, hopefully not wearing a mask, if I can do that lawfully. But they'll see me, and they'll probably know through their smartphone apps and whatever that I'm not vaccinated and I'm not immune or whatever. And that's just fine with me. But I think it's really important that we make our decisions now. We kind of make our beds now, so to speak, because otherwise the decision is going to be made for us in a moment of panic when these things suddenly come into play, and social will make us just automatically go along with the easiest option. So we need to set our positions now. I think that's a particularly important point. Other than that, it does seem that there may be ways that we can get around the mask wearing. I think all of us are particularly opposed to that. And there are such things as writing a letter of conditional acceptance, where you're basically saying, I agree to wear a mask if prove that such and such, that the mask isn't dangerous, that the pandemic exists, these various things, and maybe we can put a description. That's there are things that can be done, and I'm hoping that lots of us will actually push the limits of what we can get away with come the 24th, because there will be shops out there, shopkeepers will turn a blind eye to this, that that are either sympathetic with us or think that imposition of a mask is a step too far, or just don't want the trouble of having to argue with someone like us because they don't think it's worth it. And I think that we need to push that. We need to push back against this, and not just let everything goes along. That said, if we absolutely cannot avoid wearing a mask, then there are various websites out there where you can get whatever you want printed on a mask. So pick a message, nice big bold message, and put that on your mask, and you have to wear that mask, then no one's going to miss it. So it could be something related to the pandemic, or you could call it a hoax right there on your face, or you could even put White Lives Matter on your mask, and then everyone you speak to when you're out and about is going to be receiving that message loud and clear. It's a time for bold actions, putting ourselves out there, or not cowering and going along to get along. This is time to make a stand.
Yeah, I agree, and some great points there. I think I'll end this stream summing that up a little bit in a short way. But thanks for joining us tonight, everybody listening. We really do appreciate it. If no one's listening, there's not much point in us talking. But yeah, I'll just sum that up by saying, courage is infectious, character is fate, and nothing leads like example. And if we're going to get anywhere, we need to be courageous, and we need to show our true character, and we need to lead. No one's going to do it for us. So cheers for tuning in, everybody. Thanks for joining me, Steed and Aedric, and we'll catch you in 2 weeks.
Cheers.
Bye for now, guys.
Bye.
Be well.